Let's talk about keeping it zipped. Actually, I don't mean that kind of keeping it zipped. Nothing salacious here. I'm talking about zips that you put in garments or in soft furnishings. There's so many different zips to choose from. You can choose from zips that you just want to put on show as design feature. They might have metallic teeth, they might have sparkling crystal teeth, or of course you've got the other end of the scale, you've got zips that are invisible and you stitch them in very carefully with an invisible foot and all you can see is a tiny tab at the top. I'm going to show two main ways to insert a regular zip: centred as on dresses, the front of a jacket or in soft furnishings, or lapped as on skirts and trousers, etc. This is a centred zip. With a centred zip, the teeth are in the centre of the opening and you can see the stitching on the outside all the way round. Now I've inserted it into the middle of a seam here because this is going to be a cushion back. But the first thing to do before you start inserting the zip, just zigzag stitch in the seam allowance and then you can trim close to that stitching. Once that's done, the next thing is to put the zip in position and then mark where the bottom of the zip is. Now I'm going to mark where the bottom of the zip finishes, not the tape finishes. And because I'm doing this into a cushion cover, it's not at the top either. So again, I'm going to mark at the top of where the zip pull is. And now I stitch the seam. I'm going to stitch down to that mark using a regular stitch. Then I'm going to use a basting stitch to continue all the way through the zip opening. And then when we get to where the zip finishes, I'm going to do a regular stitch again to the end. So I stitch with a regular stitch down to that first mark. And then when I get to that first mark, I'm going to reverse stitch just to make sure it's nice and secure. And then I'm going to increase my stitch length to the widest it can be to continue basting down the length of the zip. And when I get to the end here, I'm going to now decrease my stitch length again. And again, I'm going to reverse back to the end stop there, because I want to be able to remove the basting stitches but leave the regular seam in, and then to the end. So press that seam allowance open. I'm just going to finger press it for speed, but I do recommend pressing on an ironing board. And then place the zip face down and make sure it's placed within the marks that you've made earlier, with the zip teeth over the seam. And pin it through all layers. And now I'm going to machine base that in position, working from the wrong side. I'm going to use a zipper foot so I can get quite close to the teeth, although I don't need to get that close at the moment, but I will do in a minute. And I'm going to use the longest stitch length possible. So with my zipper foot on, I'm just going to quickly machine down the centre. Not worrying too much because this stitching is going to come off. This is just to hold the zip in place. Not worried too much about how straight I am with that because it is just holding the zip in place temporarily. And now I'm going to do the other side, so I've moved the zip foot over And I'm moving the needle over so that it doesn't hit the edge of the foot. And I'm going to move it over as far as it can go. And again, just using the longest stitch possible, stitch up the side, just to hold it in place until I stitch it from the right side. This is a really handy little gadget. If you need to wind a new bobbin when you're in the middle of a seam or middle of stitching and you don't want to have to unthread the machine, this little handy device is just for you. You can literally wind any bobbin on it, put it all through the feeds as it shows there, and then you press the start, put that in place. Okay, so it stops automatically when it's full. Now it's basted in position, I'm going to remove the basting stitches that held the seam closed because I want to be able to get in there and pull the zipper open halfway through stitching it in place properly. And there we are. Just need to pull the little tails out. Sometimes a pair of tweezers would come in handy here just to pull out these little bits of thread. So I'm now going to work from the right side of the fabric to stitch the zip in permanently. And this way I can see exactly what it is I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm going to work from the right side from the base of the zip, and I've got my zip foot on the right way, but I'm going to move the needle over so that it can get close to the zip teeth, and I'm starting right on the bottom of the seam line. So I can pivot with it down, and then with that seam line in mind, I'm going to stitch up from the right side through all thicknesses. When I get near to the top here, I want to open the zipper. So I've put the needle down, lift the presser foot, open it up, and then that means I can get to the top without any problem. And just reverse stitch to lock the stitching in. So having done the one side, I'm now going to stitch the other side, again starting from the bottom. And move the zip head below the foot so it's nicely out of the way. Now all that remains is to take out the basting stitchings that temporarily held the zip in place and of course press it, and then we're ready to add the cushion front and finish the cushion. That's centred zip covered, so now let's look at a lap zip. This is the one that goes in skirts and trousers, etc. Very similar to a fly zip that you'd get in jeans. It has a lap of fabric over the teeth and you can only see the stitching on one side. Prepare the seam as before, regular stitch down to the top of the zip, basting stitch down to the foot of the zip, regular stitch to the end of the seam. Press the seams open, and now here's where it's different. I'm going to open the zip and then place it in the markings, but I'm going to attach it to the left seam allowance only. And I'm going to make sure that the zip teeth are over the seam. And then pin in place. And now I'm going to baste down the centre of the zip tape just to hold it steady before I sew it properly. This is one time where I do place the pins vertically down the seam line. This is just that much easier to stitch and pull them out as it holds it in place. And now I'm going to fold the seam allowance back on itself and pin it close to the teeth. And then I'm going to stitch through the seam allowance, the fold in the seam allowance and the zip tape. So again, I'm only stitching on the seam allowance and the zip tape and not the main fabric. It's a tiny bit there to work with. I can stitch it in place. Now this is definitely a time to go slowly because you're working on a very small piece of fabric. Remember, this row of stitching will not show on the right side of the garment or the cushion cover. And again, as I get close to the zip pull, I'm going to stop with the needle down, raise the presser foot and just open up the zip so I can get that zip pull out of the way and continue to stitch close to the teeth. So now it's time to attach the zip to the other side. So I'm going to open out my cushion back and then working from the right side of the fabric, I'm going to baste the unattached side, which is this side, through all layers from the bottom until the top. And then when I've done that, yet again I shall open up the seam and then stitch properly. So the first stage is to start at the bottom. I'm stitching about 13 millimeters, half an inch away from the seam line. So I'm just opening up the basting stitches that held the seam together temporarily so that I can get to the top of the zip. There we are. I'll be able to open it up nicely when I'm ready. So now I'm ready to actually stitch it properly and permanently in place. And one way of doing it and making sure you get a lovely straight line of stitching is actually to draw a chalk line along the line you want to stitch along. So I changed to a regular stitch length again, and as before, starting at the bottom at the seam, just stitch across. And I'm going to follow my blue line. I should have drawn a yellow one. I could have followed the yellow brick road. I'm going to stop as before, move the zip pull down past the foot so I can continue sewing to the end. that's it, all finished. Now I just need to remove the basting stitches and brush away the chalk line, and I'm ready to put the front back on. But before I make the cushions, by putting the cushion fronts on and sewing them together, I'm actually going to trim the cushion fronts, and that's the next section. Choosing and using trims can turn a plain cushion or curtain into something really special, in fact a designer original. And there's so many fantastic trims available nowadays. You just add them to the edges, on the front or in the seam, and you've got something really special. Just look at all these fantastic trims. These trims are all from British Trimmings. And there's everything you need here. There's a heavy bullions, beaded trims, lightweight ones that look lovely on the edge of a curtain or on a cushion, even feathery ones. You can see how even simple cushion patterns like these just have a nice trim around the edge, and there you've got something special. Or piping. More trims on this one, there's some down the centres. This is surface trim. This is inseam. So now I'm going to show you how to actually apply them. Firstly, I'll show the surface trim and then the inseam trim. It really is easy, of course, when you know how. Some of these really beautiful trims are sort of finished trim, so you can apply them to the surface and you haven't got to worry about raw edges or anything. To do that, you literally stitch down both long edges. I've already put the narrow one on, and I'm now going to attach the wider one. So I'm starting right at the edge, so the edge of the trim here, which could unravel of course because it's the cut edge, that will be in the seam later. And a good distance from the side of the cushion front is about 5 centimetres or 2 inches. And I'm literally going to stitch using a thread to match the trim, just locking those stitches by reversing, and then just stitching down the edge all the way to the end. Being able to change the needle position like this, move it over as far as I want it to go, is such a boon. That's ready. A nice press, and then we can put the back on top, stitch all the way around the edge, leaving a gap for turning, and that's a new cushion cover. So another way to apply surface trim is to mitre the corners. So again, it's all on the front, it's not in the seams, but I've mitred the corner. Now I'm going to show how to do that, because of course it's easy when you know how. So the first thing to do is stitch down both long edges, down as far as the new stitching line that you want to turn at, and then you take it out, fold it up, back on itself, fold it again at right angles, so it's now going to run along the new line. Now if you can press that fold in place, that's great. If you can't, just use a pin. This is too thick to hold a press. So I'm just going to put a pin through to the right angle, then I unfold it again, and I can see where that pin's come out, and that's where I've got to stitch. So I'm now going to stitch that diagonal line from the top of the pin down to the corner. Right, so you just literally stitch across, and again I'm going to reverse stitch to lock those stitches in, right across to the corner, reverse stitch again, and that trim back along itself. Now that's now stitched in place, that mitre's nicely stitched in place. Fold it back along the seam line and put it under ready to stitch. And again I'm going to stitch down both long edges. Another great thing about my little brother here is he's got this little button on here, a balancing button, so it'll balance the foot for me when I'm starting on a really thick, bulky bit. Now I press it in. I'm going to do this awkwardly because I'd normally use this hand, but it'll be in the way. So I press that button in and I hold it in as I lower the presser foot, and that's got the foot nice and level, so I can now start stitching with the foot nice and level and it's not trying to go uphill.